Welcome back to the Tonnes Zero channel. Well, this year so far has started with a bang. We've had heat waves, we've had drought, we've had massive windstorms, thunderstorms, and most significantly, we've had some of the largest, if not the largest, set of bushfires sweep across large parts of Australia, creating incredible destruction as they go. Relocating people, damaging homes, killing people and animals, and devastating millions of hectares of farmland and bushland and national parks across our country. There's no doubt that global warming and climate change is a contributor to the severity of the bushfires, and it really just is a reminder that what we're doing here in terms of trying to understand what contribution we can make to the bigger root cause of the problem of climate change is something that's really important. So in the last video, we learned just how much our per capita average emissions are in Australia. 23 tonnes a day, roughly, which comes down to 63 kilograms per day. We now understand the scope of the problem that we're facing, and it's a big one. This is a lot of gas going up into the air per person. Today, we're going to try and understand where these emissions come from. And just to start, I've done a quick brainstorm of what we think are the emissions. What are the things out there that are contributing, that in a day-to-day type of way, where am I contributing emissions? So we look at electricity, things like air conditioning, the pool pump, around the home, the refrigerators, the lights, there's all of those sorts of things. We have our cars and our transportation, whether it's cars or other forms of public transport or similar. We use flights, we use gas for cooking, for heating, maybe for hot water. We consume food, and the production of food is a contributor to emissions. We create emissions in our work environment. Now, I don't know if they belong to me, or they belong to the person paying me, or they belong to the person who consumes the services that are produced. Yeah, that's a bigger problem. We'll get to that. But what else? We buy things, we consume things. What's the energy involved in, and the emissions involved in making those things? And then the waste, the garbage, recycling, sewage treatment, there's a whole host of things. When we start looking for figures to see just how serious and what the quantity is against those, we don't find those categories. Unfortunately, they're too tightly broken up. The best source of information that I have at the moment around Australian emissions, and has an advantage of being released quarterly, is the quarterly update from the Australian government on what they call the National Greenhouse Inventory. So they're the sets of figures that I'm going to be referring to today. The categories include electricity, stationary energy, transport, fugitive emissions, and that is gas and coal production where methane is released, industrial processes and product use, agriculture, so the production and distribution for food, waste management and emissions from waste products that are landfilled, and then land use change, and forestry. So just cross-tabbing the formal categories with my personal emissions, just to understand how complex this is. And what it tells us is this is not a simple problem. So keeping it simple at the beginning, I don't want this to become an accounting channel. We're going to work with those categories from the top, not from the side in the first instance. But as we go forward, we might dig into those categories from the side. What are the factors? So the first and the most beneficial is land use, and that is actually responsible for negative 3.5% of our emissions. In other words, land use change, and forestry combined is absorbing 3.5% of the emissions made in Australia. As we go to the other side, in terms of creation of emissions, we see 2.2% was created by waste, 6.4 is industrial process and product use, 11.1 coming in from fugitive emissions, and that's a big number. 10% of our national emissions come from gas escaping. 12.7 is agriculture, 18.8 is transport, 19.3 comes down to stationary energy, excluding electricity, and the big one, 33.1, is electricity. So putting that into the context with proper area relationships, that shows us that if we tackle the top 4 of those as a beginning point, obviously fugitive emissions is a pretty tough one for us to tackle because I don't own a coal mine and I don't own any gas production facilities. But the top 4 are in some way controllable, and with that we have over 75% of our emissions. So we're going to start with those 4. The first part that we want to tackle is electricity. It's 33% of our per capita emissions in Australia, and obviously the biggest one for us to tackle. Average Australian energy usage, again, now we want to break into the details. What do we see? So the biggest is in the commercial sector and the services sector. Second, and the one that's most controllable, is residential. That 25% or 1/4 is the stuff that I'm using here in my home for computers, for AC, for all of those things. So that's really controllable, or relatively controllable. Manufacturing is responsible for an equivalent amount at around 24%. Mining, 16%, and then the rest. Roughly 25% or 8% of my total emissions is the electricity that I'm using around the home. To tackle the other 3/4 of the savings in the energy sector, it's outside our direct control. This is manufacturing, commercial and services, mining, transport, and agriculture a little bit. They are less easy to control, and maybe I'm not responsible for those, but if a commercial operation, let's say a restaurant, is using energy, I guess when I go and eat at that restaurant, I am responsible for some of those emissions. The same, the government is consuming energy on my behalf, running their offices and doing things. Sort of, I own a portion of those as well, right? We can't just ignore 75% of the problem, otherwise our ability to get to zero becomes impossible. So we are going to need to look at all of these strands. So let's look at that tree. Average emission 63 kilos a day, electricity is 20%. Our usage in the home, 5. Other uses of electricity, 15%. We have to tackle them both. To tackle our usage in the home, over the next few weeks, I'm going to use this and a few other little devices to measure consumption of the different appliances that we have in the home. Obviously, the big ones are going to be for us in a hot climate, air conditioning. We have a pool with pool pump and chlorinator. We've got refrigerators that run all the time, televisions, you know, the normal average household. So rather than going and grabbing data from different places, we're going to put this in place for a day or a week in each of those applications, and we'll gather our own data so that we can see what our consumption is. So that's going to emerge over the coming weeks, and we'll just be giving little updates on what we learn on a week-by-week basis. The second target area that we're going to tackle, it isn't one of the biggest, it's transport. We're responsible on a per capita basis for 12% of emissions. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a challenge. We're going to look at all of the different options for transport. And for me personally, the majority of transport is commuting and local travel. It's down to the supermarket, it's going out on a weekend, it's going and seeing friends, it's going to work back and forth on a daily basis. So that's going to be the primary focus. And a little bit later, we can look at bigger things like vacations and actual transport industry of moving things around the country.
For the next 7 or 8 weeks, I'm going to try a whole range of different forms of transport. So we're going to look at
riding a bicycle, catching a ferry,
driving a car
on public transport,
riding on a scooter.
We're going to try a week of telecommuting, so I'm going to try and do everything from home. And maybe if I can get my hands on one, we're going to grab ourselves an electric vehicle and we'll do the comparison using that. And as we go through each of those, we're going to assess the effectiveness of the method. So we're going to look at cost, travel time, weather, flexibility, safety, obviously emissions, and at the end of that 8-week period, hopefully, we're in the situation where we can draw some conclusions. For me, personally, I can make a plan on what I can do to minimize my transport emissions, but also we want to be able to make that comparable for other people.
So what we're going to find is that different people who have different commutes are going to have different solutions to try and manage their emissions for transport. And we'll try as much as possible to test each of the different methods out on short, medium, and long commutes so we can compare that during the course of the exercise.
That's the challenge, the commuting challenge. Little episodes as we go forward, trying to learn as much as possible about the different options, seeing how practical they are. At the end of the exercise, we'll have some data on how I can plan my commute. So week 1, next week, is getting in the car. Okay, so that's it for episode 3. What have we learned? Well, we've learned that roughly a third of our emissions come from electricity, followed by other energy use as the next biggest contributor. Transport, agriculture, and fugitive emissions make up together the majority, more than 90% of our emissions. So we're going to tackle those top 4 over the coming episodes and start breaking down into the detail and starting to do some measurements, some experiments, and some tests against each of those. So hoping you can join us. If you're interested, click subscribe, click on the bell, and then you'll be notified as we release the videos. I'm doing this as a side gig. I am not going to be following a super regular program. I will do my best, but the reality is some of these episodes are going to take a lot more time to produce than others. So by clicking on the bell, you're going to find out when we have a new video ready and you'll be able to follow along. So thanks for your attention today, and we look forward to seeing you for episode 4. Ciao.